There's a religious scholar named Mircea Eliade who looked at flood myths, because there are flood myths all over the world. God gets fed up, floods everything. It's like just like in New Orleans. So here's a funny thing about New Orleans. What caused the New Orleans flood? Well, a hurricane.
No.
Yeah? No. How about human corruption? How about the corruption of the state? How about the fact that people knew the damn dikes weren't going to hold? That the levees weren't going to hold? How about that they knew that for 100 years and didn't care? How about that they pocketed the money that should have gone for their repair? And so in flood myths, you always see two things. You see that, I'm paraphrasing, say, there's a storm, there's dikes, and there's people responsible for maintaining the dikes. Well, a storm won't wipe out the city. It could. But if the dikes are high enough, then it won't. And if people aren't corrupt, then they build the dikes properly. And so God floods the world when the dikes have rotted and the people have become corrupt. And it's a very old story, and it's disseminated everywhere. And the reason is well, we inhabit a social structure that's old and dead. Our infrastructure is decayed. Our political, economic, and practical infrastructure has decayed. Well, why? It's old. Everything decays. Okay, everything's always decaying. That's dangerous. And corrupt people don't do a very good job of keeping it in order. And so if things get old and decayed enough, and if people get corrupt enough, then God floods the world. Why? Because that's what happens. Over and over and over and over and over.
And you don't mean God in the literal sense of the word. You mean God as these are the consequences to these type of actions. You are not prepared
you could say
for what you
transcendent
think.
Reality.
Right.
You could look at it that way. You know, and I mean, the idea of God is a very, very complicated idea, but you could say, if you were thinking about it merely from an intellectual perspective, is you could say that God is what transcends your knowledge. That's all. It's what you don't know. It's what's outside of your knowledge structures. And there's a very old story, and this goes all the way back to the Tower of Babel, is that one of the things that characterizes authoritarians is that there's never anything outside of their knowledge structures. They make their knowledge structures absolute. So in the Tower of Babel, human beings build this structure that's supposed to reach all the way to heaven, so that we can invade the place of the gods. Well, God has none of that. He just blows it apart and throws people all over the world. It's a very early dramatic representation of the danger of human hubris. And the hubris is, we know everything. There's nothing that needs to be left outside of what we know. It's like, no, that's what God is. God is what's always outside of what you know.
Is the problem with the term God? Though the people think of God as being a man. They think of it being a person. They even use the masculine pronouns in reference to God. I mean, that's one of the funniest things about God, is calling him a he.
Well, it's a problem. I mean, and that's certainly been a problem. Jung talked about that a lot, about the exclusion of the feminine within the domains of classic Judeo-Christian thought, for example. I mean, you have Mary, who's a kind of a quasi-deity, who pops in sort of like as a fourth member of the Trinity. But the exclusion of the feminine is definitely a conceptual problem. Is the fact that God is conceptualized as a human being or as a man a problem? It's a problem and a solution. I mean, if you remove the human element of God, then God gets so abstract that it's easy for him to float off into space and to never show up again. You lose the human connection. I mean, the way the Catholics solve that to some degree is that they have God who's sort of at the top of the hierarchy, and then they have this hierarchy of saints who are sort of like gods but half human, and then they have human beings at the bottom. And that allows for what would you say, a continual chain of communication between the highest level of abstraction and the actual, the actual concrete person. But the other thing that's useful about the conceptualization of God in anthropomorphic terms is that, and this is worth noting, is there is nothing more complex in the cosmos than a human being. So if you're looking for something to represent the ultimate in complexity, it's hard to beat a human being. So your brain is ungodly complicated, so to speak.